Videos circulating on social media show luxury cars, gold-plated weapons, and ornate furniture being carried away from Syrian's President Bashar al-Assad's abandoned palace. Have you ever wondered what it means when a leader's palace is looted after their regime falls? I'm Dr. K. I'm a political scientist who looks at how information is shared, but I also show people how to see what's not shared by looking for clues that can help you understand global politics better. In this video, we're going to be looking at the actions of security forces and what they reveal about a crumbling regime, and why protesters often target leaders' homes, using examples from Syria, Ukraine, Sri Lanka, and the Philippines. And I'll show you how to read between the lines of news reports to uncover more about global politics and leadership. Reports beginning on December 7, 2024, say Syrian President Bashar Assad left Syria after over 24 years in power. He leaves behind over a decade of civil war, international sanctions, and widespread condemnation for human rights abuses, supported by key allies like Russia and Iran. His regime survived with military backing, the strategic use of propaganda, and the suppression of opposition. On December 8, 2024, rebel forces swept into the Syrian capital, Damascus, and entered the presidential palace. How the homes of leaders are accessed is one of the first indicators you should look for. These actions or inactions of security forces can show a lot about the leader they were protecting and the state of the regime. Typically, the security forces either abandon their posts, defect, or are overwhelmed by the sheer force of the mob. Each scenario tells a different story about the leader and their grip on power. When security forces abandon their posts, guards flee as looters approach, often out of fear for their lives or because there's a lack of order from higher ups. This shows a breakdown in the chain of command, often signaling that the regime is collapsing. It can also show that security personnel no longer feel loyal to the leader. This is what happened in Ukraine in 2014, when protesters approached Viktor Yanukovych's palace. Many of the guards simply left. They had lost faith in Yanukovych's ability to maintain power, and his reputation for corruption didn't help. Protesters, looters, rebels, I know they're not the same thing, but in this discussion, we're talking about who's trying to gain access to the private homes of leaders, groups that oppose the leader. When security forces defect or switch sides, this means they join the opposition, indicating that they no longer see the leader as legitimate, suggesting that their rule was likely based on fear or monetary incentives rather than any genuine allegiance. The regime may have alienated its own protectors through poor treatment or loss of credibility. In Sri Lanka in 2022, some security forces reportedly just stood aside as citizens stormed the presidential palace. When security forces are overwhelmed, they may try to defend the palace, but they're overpowered by the crowds due to the sheer numbers or insufficient resources. This tells us that the leader underestimated public anger or failed to provide adequate protection, reflecting poor strategic planning. The lack of preparation suggests either arrogance or isolation from the reality of public sentiment. An example of this is the storming of Saddam Hussein's palaces in Iraq, where the looting was a combination of military defeats and mass public resentment. Ultimately, when security forces give up or defect, it serves as a public signal that the leader's power has crumbled. Security forces behavior is something to watch for in these reports. But why do people even go to a leader's house? Large gatherings at government buildings, military bases, or public squares can also be effective. But opposition movements that focus on a leader's home personalize the protest. This is something you see in non-democratic systems more often, where homes are where wealth and privilege have been hidden after having been accumulated at the cost of the general population. As Viktor Yanukovych fled from his lavish home in Ukraine to Russia, just like Assad in 2024, Ukrainian opposition groups invited the public to experience the opulence, exposing the corruption of a leader who lived in a giant palace with private lakes, a zoo full of exotic animals, rooms decorated with gold, and even bathroom fittings plated in gold.
Shut up! It's also gold.
This was happening while ordinary Ukrainians were struggling to make ends meet. In 1986, in the Philippines, the Marcos Palace was stormed by protesters, and the lavish spending of Imelda Marcos was discovered by her shoe collection. This enraged Filipinos who had endured poverty under the regime. And again, in Sri Lanka, protesters swam in the pool and lounged on beds at the presidential palace, symbolizing a public reclaiming the wealth that had been hoarded while they faced economic collapse. Going to a leader's home is about what the space represents. The secrecy and isolation of these residences, it symbolizes the gap between the rulers and the ruled. Why is that? In many parts of the world, leaders in power often hide their enormous wealth and luxurious lifestyles from the people they govern. While citizens struggle to afford basic needs like food and medicine, corrupt leaders live in secret luxury, keeping the riches out of sight to avoid anger and rebellion. But a leader's home doesn't have to be looted for you to understand more about how a country is run. There's a noticeable correlation between the accessibility of a leader's home and the level of democracy in a country. In democratic systems, leaders are often seen as public servants, accountable to the people who elect them. This accountability can be symbolized in how accessible their homes are, both literally and figuratively. Think about the White House in the United States. Though highly secured, it's partially accessible to the public through guided tours. And it's not just the house of the president, but also a symbol of government transparency and accountability. Or 10 Downing Street in the United Kingdom. The Prime Minister's official residence is located on a public street and has become a symbol of leadership within reach of the people. In contrast, authoritarian leaders often use their residences as symbols of power and control, hidden behind walls and guarded by military forces. This physical separation mirrors the lack of accountability in authoritarian regimes. If you want to learn more about ways to read between the lines of news reporting, I've included a list of things to think about in the comments of this video. Hybrid warfare is destabilizing societal structures, whether it's trust in government, science, or the media. With so much disinformation and misinformation, learning how to analyze things is an important skill. I've always thought that shared knowledge is never lost, and videos like this are how I do my part to strengthen democratic resilience. Let me know if you'd like more videos like this. I'm Dr. K.